The word, in fact, Titanic, means gargantuan. In fact, I heard a news story the other night. We have a tower in San Francisco called the Millennium Tower, and it's starting to lean. It's leaned 29 inches in the last 5 years. And there are many people who paid a lot of money for condos in that apartment house, and it's starting to lean over. And they're working desperately to kind of bolster it with pilings and foundations to try to lift up one side of it so it doesn't fall over. Because I think it's 30 floors. It's a pretty good sized building. But anyway, the reporter said, this is a Titanic building that's got a Titanic problem. And I thought, that's interesting that people would use that word to describe something disastrous. I used to go to a marina on occasions because I had a sailboat at one time, and I spent the night on my sailboat occasionally when I lived in San Diego. And I noticed all the unique names for boats in the marina. You know, everybody's got their kind of pet name, and boats are referred to as she, and a lot of them have female names. I have never seen a sailboat or a boat in the harbor, a yacht, named Titanic. I think we can imagine the reason why, right? It was the greatest maritime disaster, non-military, in world history. It was 110 years ago, this year. The Titanic was a British passenger liner that sank in the Atlantic Ocean on April 15th, 1912. Because it collided with an iceberg during its maiden voyage from England to New York City. The sinking caused the deaths of 1,514 people, considered the deadliest maritime disaster in history. It was one of 3 Olympic, quote-unquote, class ocean liners operated by the White Star Line out of New York, and was the largest ship afloat at the time. There were 2,224 people on this voyage, including some of the wealthiest people in the world, as well as 1,000 immigrants from Britain, Ireland, and Scandinavia in the lower decks, seeking a new home in North America. Let's go to 1 Timothy. You're probably wondering, what in the world does the Titanic have to do with the Sabbath following the days of unleavened bread? 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 18. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 18. This is, of course, a letter to the young evangelist, Timothy. Paul considered a son. He was giving him some advice. And these letters in Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy, are often used as a guide for not only ordination, but for the ministry in many ways. Not exclusively for the ministry, but there are many things here that advise the ministry. In verse 18 of chapter 1 of 1 Timothy, Paul wrote, "This charge I commit to you, son Timothy, according to the prophecies or the inspired preaching previously made concerning you, that by them you may wage the good warfare." Paul often talked in nautical terms. Have you noticed that? Talked, in Hebrews about the doctrinal drift that can happen. And he uses nautical terms about ships that drift away from the dock very slowly and almost unnoticeably. He talks in many places because he was familiar with the sea. He sailed everywhere. That was the best way to get around Asia Minor in those days, all the way from Rome to Egypt. It was all sailboats. So when he talks about a good warfare, he's talking about what people were familiar with, these battles that often happened on warships or because of warships. In verse 19, he says, "Having faith and a good conscience, which some having rejected concerning the faith have suffered shipwreck. Paul described those who had fallen away from the faith as being shipwrecked. Now, Paul knew about shipwreck. This is the second time the Greek word describing shipwreck is used in the Bible. Paul used it also, or it was used in the Bible to describe what Paul experienced. He says he was a day and a half in the sea after his ship had grounded and listed, and before he was finally miraculously rescued. He was very familiar with the principle of shipwreck. And I thought I would take the example of the Titanic today and talk about how to avoid spiritual shipwreck from the example of the Titanic. In fact, I've entitled this sermon, Titanic Lessons. I'm going to share with you 4 lessons today from the history of the Titanic, which we're somewhat familiar with. I'm going to be weaving through some of the history and some scriptures today in covering these 4 points. On April the 10th, Titanic left England heading westward towards New York. 4 days into the Atlantic crossing, it hit an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on April 14th. The glancing collision caused Titanic's hull plates to buckle in a number of locations and opened 5 watertight compartments to the sea. Over the next 2.5 hours, the ship gradually filled with water and sank. Passengers and some crew members were evacuated in lifeboats, many of which were launched only partially filled. Just before 2:20 a.m. on April the 15th, the Titanic broke up and sank bow first, with over 1,000 people still on board. Just over 700 survivors were rescued from lifeboats by the RMS Carpathia a few hours later. The wreckage remains on the seabed at a depth of 2 1/3 miles, gradually disintegrating. Since its discovery in 1985, thousands of artifacts have been recovered from the seabed and put on display at museums around the world. Lesson number 1 of my 4 lessons. Lesson number 1, avoid being overconfident, or I might add, self-confident, because we want to put a spiritual application to this wreckage as Paul did. We need to avoid being overconfident or self-confident, distinct from confidence in God. Titanic's captain, Edward Smith, 5 years earlier was captain of the Adriatic, the White Star Line's biggest ship to that date. Of the Adriatic, he said, "I cannot imagine any condition which would cause a ship to founder. I cannot conceive of any vital disaster happening to this vessel. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that." Also, a White Star Line promotional flyer for the Olympic and the Titanic claimed, and I quote, "As far as is possible to do, these 2 wonderful vessels are designed to be unsinkable." As news of the Titanic accident started to trickle in, most newspapers were reporting that it hit an iceberg, but all passengers were safe. The mood was very optimistic in New York. A group of supporters gathered around the New York offices of the White Star Line and questioned the company's vice president. He reassured everyone by saying, "We place absolute trust and confidence in the Titanic. There is no danger that Titanic will sink. The boat is unsinkable, and nothing but inconvenience will be suffered by the passengers." Let's go to 1 Corinthians 5. 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 6. 1 Corinthians 5:6. The Corinthian church had a little bit of a problem. They were Corinth, after all. Corinth was a city on the sea. In fact, in the middle of Corinth is a land bridge less than 4 miles across that joins the Mediterranean to the sea of the Grecian Sea. In fact, it's kind of interesting. Ships actually learned that if they landed in the port on the Mediterranean side, they could actually roll their cargo on logs, round logs, across the 4-mile strip to a ship on the opposite side of the isthmus and sail on into to Greece and Rome and other places and save several days and hundreds of miles on the water. In fact, it's interesting that during the days of Nero, when you hear the history, I think it's amazing. Nero was going to, in fact, he had 1,000 slaves of the Roman Empire that moved into Corinth, and they started digging a canal between the two seas. And his engineer stopped him. They said, "No, don't do it," because they threatened that the Mediterranean Sea would flow in to the other sea, that it was a higher elevation, and would flood the city of Corinth and a lot of Greece. So he stopped. Didn't do it. It wasn't until about 1,000 years later that it was actually accomplished. And there is now a canal that goes right through the city of Corinth, connects the two seas. But my point is, the city was very rich because there was a lot of traffic that traveled through the city. There were a lot of sailors there. There were a lot of whorehouses on the beach. In fact, the caves are still there, and if you tour there, you can see this was for the benefit of the sailors. There was the biggest temple of prostitutes up on the hill overlooking the city that Paul referred to when he was in Corinth. Most of the members there seemed to be fairly rich and confident, and they were proud of their open-mindedness. So proud of their open-mindedness that they would accept a man into the congregation who was sleeping with his stepmom. It was no problem, We're open-minded here. We tolerate stuff like that. So let's pick up, with that background, let's pick up the story here in verse 6 of 1 Corinthians 5. Your glorying is not good. They were kind of proud of their open-mindedness, their wealth. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? A little sin can lead to bigger things, bigger sins. Overconfidence in oneself can lead to greater dangers. Therefore, purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed, Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. We need to be in a more spiritual frame of mind, Paul was saying, not so much just a physical frame of mind. Therefore, let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And I imagine you've heard this verse a couple times in the last week, a time or two. But again, I wanted to frame it in this warning that Paul gave about being overconfident. And they were bragging about their open-mindedness and their ability and their wealth, and what a wonderful congregation they were. Let's go over to chapter 10 and verse 12, because he warns them again. 1 Corinthians 10:12, they were actually getting to the point, they were getting cliquish. They were starting to fight among themselves. There were some people who said, you may recall, well, I love Apollos. He's a great speaker. I'm of Apollos. And others said, well, I'm of Paul because I came in the church through Paul's preaching. And others said, well, I think I follow Christ. I'm even better than you guys that follow and support Apollos or Paul. You know how these things can kind of develop. They were a divided congregation. Their pride had taken them in the wrong direction. Pride literally often leads to division. Verse 12, Paul wrote, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Once we begin to think we're in pretty good shape, physically or spiritually, we need to watch out, because God's going to allow a curveball to come in and surprise us. Since Noah's Ark, the Titanic was the largest man-made moving object in the world. It was designed to be the ultimate in comfort and luxury. And it had a powerful wireless telegraph provided for the convenience of passengers. It is well known that the Titanic didn't carry enough lifeboats. While the ship was able to carry 32 lifeboats, the owners opted for only 20, primarily out of concern that more lifeboats would distract from the ship's appearance from shore. Other safety features that were possible were rejected in favor of what was considered practical. As Walter Lord wrote, the appearance of safety was mistaken for safety itself. When the order came from Captain Smith to begin loading lifeboats, the ship's officers were probably unaware of the magnitude of the situation. Their apparent complacency did not instill a sense of urgency and therefore caused many passengers to decline the opportunity to even get into a lifeboat. I think we have a lot of parallels to our nation today, don't we? We here in the United States feel very confident that nothing like is happening in Ukraine could happen to us. Our economy is strong. We're the number one nation in the world. And yet, how strong is it? You know how fast we're spending money? 800 million there, 800 million here, 1.5 trillion there. It's just paper. It's just confidence, right? We feel that nothing could cause these United States of America to crumble. Nothing could ever affect our economy. That's overconfidence, and that's a danger, isn't it? We've already had challenges with electrical grids. What would happen if our cell towers would go down? What would we all do with our cell phones and smartphones? A lot of people think, well, that would never happen. And yet it happened. It's interesting, it happened in the Ukraine, and because the Russians did not have the foresight to imagine it could happen, all of their communication systems were based on cell phone operation. And they had to go back to old walkie-talkies, which could easily be heard by intelligence. And this caused, of course, them to suffer a lot of probably unnecessary damage to their armored vehicles as they were marching towards Kyiv. In other words, you know the story, but it was kind of interesting to me that one of the real chinks in the armor of the Russian army was that they didn't expect the cell system to fall down, and yet they were bombing it. In fact, is it possible that we put technology at a higher level than God? Because we're so confident in ourselves, these Americans that we are. Let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 9. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 9. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts which drown men in destruction. Notice the language. Like shipwreck, it's drown. He understood that if we get overconfident, start swaggering around on the decks, and a rogue wave comes up, launches you in the water, what are you going to do? You know, we're going to drown. Very possibly. He says these things can drown us in destruction and perdition. Verse 10, for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. But you, O man of God, flee these things and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, gentleness, the spiritual riches. Fight the good fight of faith. Lay hold on eternal life, to which You are also called and have confessed the good confession in the presence of many witnesses. We are called upon not to be overly confident in our nation, in our economy, in ourselves, but confident in God and the spiritual characteristics that need to be developed as we read here in verse 11. That's where our confidence should be. That caused the demise of the Titanic. They were overconfident, very clearly, and they didn't take seriously the dangers that were there. Lesson number 2. We must be on the lookout for sin in our lives, not just during the days of unleavened bread, but beyond. You know, we can't consider, oh yeah, we left the days of unleavened bread yesterday, last night at sunset. Leaven no longer pictures sin. You know, Christ talked about the kingdom of heaven is like leaven. You know, so today leaven means something else, and we kind of forget about being diligent about making sure that watching out for sin in our lives is a 24/7 job, 365 days a year. It's not just during the days of unleavened bread that we want to be conscious of this. Back to the history of the Titanic. Through the morning, afternoon, and evening of April 14th, Titanic received at least 6 calls regarding the ice fields and iceberg sightings and warnings from other ships in the same area. Some of the warnings never made it to the bridge until hours later, because Titanic's radio operator was preoccupied in sending and receiving personal passenger messages. At 9:40 p.m., the Masaba reported thick ice pack, field ice, and icebergs in the location where Titanic was sailing. Titanic's wireless operator was so preoccupied with passengers' personal messages, he set the warning aside and didn't deliver it to the captain. We might ask, of course, what's more important? Staying in touch with friends or watching for icebergs? They look little, icebergs do sometimes, don't they? That's a little sin. But below the surface, it could belie a character flaw we have in our lives. And we have to be aware of those and always watch out for them. Let's go to 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 26. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 26. I'm sorry, it's 1 Thessalonians 5, 2 through 6. 1 Thessalonians 5, 2. For you yourselves know perfectly well that day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. It's kind of interesting. At 9 p.m. on the Titanic, the crow's nest lookouts were ordered to keep a sharp watch for icebergs. It was a clear night, but there was no moonlight. It was dark. Any icebergs would not be directly visible, which is why other ships in the area had stopped steaming until daylight. It was a dark night, but the Titanic, in its self-confidence, steamed ahead. We too find ourselves in the night in this world, which we heard about, Satan's world. Verse 3, for when we say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, as labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, so that this day should come upon you as a thief. You are all sons of light and sons of the day. We are not of the night nor of the darkness. Therefore, let us not sleep as others do, but let us watch and be sober. Had they really been watching, Titanic may have been saved. Had they been listening, might have been saved. Hebrews 12:1, I won't turn there, but Hebrews 12:1 says, sin so easily ensnares us. Like those icebergs encircled the Titanic, much to their oblivion or not even noticed. The Titanic hit that iceberg. Let me read this portion of history again. At 1:39 p.m., Lookout Frederick Fleet picked up a phone to the bridge and said, "Iceberg right ahead." The bridge immediately sent a stop signal to the engine room, followed by a full astern. The Titanic turned to the left, scraping along the iceberg. Many passengers slept right through it. Others felt a slight shudder, but didn't think much of it, rolled over in bed and went back to sleep. Time from sighting the iceberg to impact was just over 30 seconds. The iceberg the Titanic struck was not a particularly big one, not even as high as the ship's bridge. But the iceberg below the surface cut a gash 300 feet long and buckled the iron plates. The total area of breach open to the seawater was about 12 square feet, about the same size as your refrigerator door. Just a long gash. The Titanic sank 2 hours, 40 minutes after spotting and scraping that small iceberg. So lesson 2, we must always be on the lookout for sin, even the little things. Lesson number 3, we must keep the wireless communication open. We must keep the wireless communication open. At 10:50 p.m., about 20 miles north of the Titanic, the Californians sent a wireless message to Titanic telling them that they were stopped and they were surrounded by ice. Before the Californian could relay its position, Titanic wireless operator Jack Phillips angrily responded, "Shut up, I'm busy. I'm working on Cape Race," which is radio jargon for sending passengers personal messages. The Californian's wireless operator waited patiently to resend the message and then finally gave up, turned off his equipment, and went to bed. Had he left it on, the Californian could have later heard Titanic's distress calls, and being only 20 miles away, would likely have saved all the passengers before it sank. Let's go to Hebrews 4. Hebrews chapter 4. What is our wireless communication? Well, I think we all know it's prayer. Notice what Paul wrote here in Hebrews 4:14. Hebrews 4:14. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest that cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Now verse 16. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. We must maintain open, wireless communication with God through prayer. Frankly, that's the only way we can overcome the icebergs of sin, is with repentance, which involves prayer, and contact with God. At 12:05 a.m., now April 15th, back in 1912, Captain Smith ordered wireless operators to send a distress call to all ships in the area. However, many ships had shut down their wireless at night, as it was thought to be needed mainly just for personal communication. At 12:25 a.m., the Carpathia heard Titanic's distress signal, but it was 58 miles away. At 2:10 a.m., the last wireless distress signals were sent before power to Titanic's radio room was completely lost. The Titanic lost 25 precious minutes before ever sending the first distress signal. And if wireless communication had been maintained with the Californian, again, all lives might have been saved. Finally, lesson number 4. Lesson number 4. Hypothermia is lethal. And I might add, spiritual lethargy is lethal. Comparing it to hypothermia physically. 711 passengers ended up in lifeboats. 1,500 did not. But most of those who were in the water did have life jackets. However, even though they stayed afloat in the water, they quickly died from hypothermia in the 28-degree Atlantic water. Hypothermia is when you first get into very cold water, you hyperventilate for about a minute. Next, your breathing slows down and there's a shivering and slight confusion. This progresses to violent shivering, impaired coordination, slowed movements, and difficulty in thinking. This is followed by numbness, the inability to perform any dexterity task, difficulty speaking, mental confusion, even amnesia, and then your organs begin to fail. Then unconsciousness, and finally death. In 28-degree water, this can happen in a space of less than 15 minutes. Let's finally go to Ephesians 4. Ephesians 4, verse 17 through 24. Ephesians 4:17. Paul wrote, "This I say, therefore, and testify in the Lord, that you should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles walk, in the futility of their mind, having their understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, who being past feeling have given themselves over to lewdness, to work all uncleanness with greediness. But you have not so learned Christ. If indeed you have heard him and have been taught by him as the truth in Jesus." Verse 22. "That you put off concerning your former conduct the old man, which grows corrupt according to the deceitful lusts, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and that you put on the new man, which was created according to God in true righteousness and holiness." When we find ourselves into sin, it's critical that we seek God's help to remove it from our lives as soon as possible. Do we have a tender conscience? Feeling guilty about sin, not becoming less sensitive? If we confess, God will forgive. But if we continue in sin, eventually our thinking gets confused. We become past feeling. We become numb to sin. I call it spiritual hypothermia. Our mind gets fuzzy and we no longer process the sin rationally. If we didn't extricate ourselves with God's help and his forgiveness, it will eventually take over our spiritual lives. And we, like Alexander and Hymenaeus, could become shipwrecked, as Paul wrote. So in summary, the 4 points again, the Titanic lessons we can learn from the Titanic are: number 1, avoid being overly self-confident. Place our confidence in God. Number 2, make sure we are always aware and looking for sin, spiritual leaven in our lives. Number 3, make sure we stay in communication with God and receive His word. And number 4 is we must avoid spiritual hypothermia, lethargy. Brethren, we can learn the lessons needed to avoid spiritual shipwreck. We must stay close to God for His help and guidance. If we take seriously the lessons of the Titanic, then we will make it safely to our destination, the first resurrection and the kingdom of God.